My parents used my social security number to take out lines of credit, open bank accounts, and co-sign a business loan they never intended to pay back, all to cover my younger sister's medical bills. They did it without telling me. I found out when my employer called to tell me my background check came back inconsistent, and a debt collector called me about a car I had never owned. It hurt because they'd always taught me that our names, our signatures, were the one thing no one in our family would take lightly. They'd raised me on the idea that identity is private, sacred. So when I learned they had been spending mine like it was their cash, it felt like they reached into my chest and started spending pieces of me. We need to take a beat on the people involved so the rest of this makes sense. My name is Anna, I'm 33. I work as a court clerk in a mid-sized county courthouse. It's steady work, I know procedure, and I like the predictability. My parents, Maria and Henry, are in their late 60s. They've been married 42 years. My sister, Leah, is 27. She'd been on and off sick since college. What started as an eating disorder turned into a mess of autoimmune complications and a breakdown that made it impossible for her to keep a steady job. For a long time, my parents shouldered the bills. They had a small house in a quiet neighborhood, a modest retirement account, and pride. They also had an instinct to fix things immediately, even when it meant cutting corners. I couldn't simply move out and wash my hands of them the way I wanted to. I was living with them at the time because my grandmother's dementia had worsened and we needed someone around to keep her on medication. I had student loans and a mortgage I had barely been keeping up with. I was her caregiver some days and my parents' only reliable point of contact for paperwork on others. When Leah's condition worsened the year before, my parents told me they had enrolled her in a private treatment program that cost a lot of money. They said they were using savings and selling old assets. They asked me to sign a form, just some paperwork to prove relationship for the program's insurance. And I trusted them. I signed because my mother asked me at the kitchen table while my grandmother dozed in the next room. I signed because sometimes family asks for a favor and you say yes without thinking about how the favor might bend your life. The first escalation was small and mundane. A bill from a collection agency arrived in my mailbox for a debt card I didn't recognize. I called, and the recorded voice read back an address I had never lived at and a balance of nearly $5,000. I was puzzled, so I checked my credit report online. There were 3 new lines of credit I had never opened, a closed auto loan with missed payments in 2019, and a business loan for a company called H&J Health Supply with my social security number attached. The accounts were in my name. My credit score was cratered. My reaction the first time was confusion and then a flush of something like nausea. I thought maybe there was a clerical error. I called my mother and said calmly, "Did you use my SSN for anything?" She said no. She sounded tired. She told me to calm down, to breathe, that she'd look into it when she finished making dinner. I told her I was going to pull the documentation. That evening, alone at my desk, I printed every page I could from the credit report, thinking 2 things at once: that there had to be a reasonable explanation, and that if there wasn't, I had no idea how to respond. The second escalation came when I discovered the first loan contract. It wasn't an email or an online form. It was a paper copy, signed, dated, and notarized. The signature looked like mine, not identical, but close enough for a notary. The loan was taken out in April of that year. The funds had been dispersed to a surgical center in another state for emergency procedures. I called the surgical center and they confirmed they had been paid in full by a check tied to the account that used my SSN. They also confirmed they had treated Leah. I remember the sensation of the room tilting as if gravity had changed. When I confronted my parents, the denial was precise and practiced. They told me they had only ever used their own credit and that it must have been identity theft by someone else. My mother cried. My father got quiet. They suggested we put a freeze on my credit and go to the bank together. I agreed because in the small domestic logic of our house, I still believed we could fix things as a family. I thought the bank would see signatures and clear everything up. Instead, the bank told me the applications had been made in person on multiple occasions with a driver's license that matched mine and with photocopies of my social security card. The bank manager said their internal investigation found IP addresses and surveillance photos that traced back to our neighborhood. He was careful with words, but he didn't need to be explicit. The person in those videos was my father signing the forms, or he was standing with a woman who looked like my mother. The bank set the file down and told me I should speak with a fraud investigator. They were kind in a clinical way. Their kindness felt like glass. At this point, the dynamic in the house altered into a new, cruel pattern. Every time I raised the subject, my parents minimized the damage. Money is money. Anna, my father said once late at night, as he sat at the kitchen table with a pile of receipts. Leah needed it. You know we did what we had to do. He added with a forced smile that they'd pay it back. They'd figure it out. When I pushed back about consent and the ethics of using another person's identity, my mother looked away and said, "You were always the responsible one. You understand these things better. Help us fix it." That sentence, "You help us fix it," became a pressure point. They turned my knowledge and my job into leverage. The courthouse where I worked did background checks. If the fraud remained attached to my name, I risked losing my position or being reassigned. They would call me unreliable, a risk. My parents understated these stakes so they could lean on me emotionally until I stepped in and tried to resolve their mess. I spent nights on calls with collection agencies, attending appointments at credit recovery centres, and informing HR about identity fraud so my job wouldn't automatically be at risk. I did all of that because the alternative was the sight of my grandmother sitting at the breakfast table, my father distracted, my mother ready to crumble. The next escalation loop was a move into outright manipulation. Once I started opening accounts on their behalf at my request, temp cards, a joint account with a financial counselor, my parents began to treat me like a lender. They would guilt me about repayments. They would flinch when a collection agency called, but then in the same breath, or demand repayment plans be structured without my involvement. One night, after I'd spent 6 hours reconciling bank statements and trying to trace where funds had gone, my mother told me quietly, "You don't have to do everything. We know we've crossed a line, but Leah is alive because of it." Her voice was small, as if apology could be muffled. I believed them for a moment. I believed the life or death framing because Leah nearly died twice in emergency rooms that year. The surgery paid for with the loans did what we needed it to do. It gave her a chance to stabilize. The gratitude and the tiny relief made me softer toward them for a while. But even gratitude can't erase the fact that your name is on the hook for other people's choices. As weeks passed, the consequences spread outward. The IRS flagged my tax return because filings from a small company in our town listed my social security number as an employee. The company turned out to be one of the shell entities my parents had created to funnel money. I sat in the tax office while a woman with a stiff bun explained that if I didn't act, I was liable. I remember the clerk folding her hands and looking at me like a ledger herself. I had no lawyer. I had a stack of photocopies and a voice wearing thin. I tried to be procedural. I filed identity theft reports. I wrote letters to creditors. I contacted an attorney who dealt with white-collar cases pro bono. Each time I took action, something else surfaced. An eviction notice from a property I had never rented, an old medical bill for a child not my own that had my name attached, a lien in another state. The picture they had painted on my credit report was of someone with wandering accounts, someone unmoored. Each new discovery came with a new humiliation. There were calls to my job asking whether the Anna at the courthouse was the same Anna with multiple outstanding liens. Rumors move quickly in small legal circles. Whispers are louder than bank calls. My reaction hardened into an exhausted ferocity. I started to prepare as if I might need to defend myself legally. I photographed receipts, copied bank statements, and spread them across my living room floor. I documented everything we found in the house. The more I looked, the more the shadow of their work revealed itself. Cancelled checks written for cash, deposit slips with strange symbols, lists of account numbers with my social security number scribbled next to them like a label on an old box. It no longer felt like a mistake. It felt like a plan, executed in panic, but a plan nonetheless. Another escalation, an anonymous tip to the county prosecutor. I don't know who placed it. It could have been the bank manager. It could have been the person at the surgical center who smelled falsehood in our stack of invoices. It could have been Leah herself after a night of clarity. The prosecutor's office sent an investigator to my house for an interview. He asked me to bring any documents I had. When I opened the second drawer in my father's file cabinet, I found a ledger, not neat, not official, but single notebook listing disbursements, names, and social security numbers. My SSN appeared there. My father's handwriting mapped to each entry. My father had always been careful. He kept receipts in labeled envelopes. He knew which electrician took checks. He balanced his checkbook in longhand. So the ledger felt like a slow betrayal unfolding in handwriting I could read. It was a record of decisions, not a one-off panic. The investigator took photographs and asked me quietly if I wanted to press charges. I felt the animal weight of my chest. I wanted to be angry and I wanted to be tender. I wanted to shake them and ask why they had made my life collateral. Instead, I said, I want the truth to come out. It was the most diplomatic sentence the investigator had probably heard from a family in his line of work, and probably the most cold-blooded. That night, the house was very quiet. My parents went to bed at their normal time. They did not speak to me. They moved through the house like people who had decided a cost had been incurred and were hoping to slow its spread. I sat in the kitchen and watched the streetlights rain across the table. In the morning, there was a letter on the counter, a certified notice from a federal agency. The language was formal and terrifying. And it said the case had been referred to federal authorities for possible identity theft and bank fraud. There were subpoenas attached to the envelope for multiple accounts. The notice requested that anyone with knowledge of the accounts come forward. The low point came quickly after the federal referral. My father left the house for 2 days and didn't answer my calls. My mother began to pack a bag with the sort of slow, small motions people make when they are trying to move without leaving fingerprints of themselves behind. Leah, who had been improving, stopped answering texts. I began to sleep in the living room because I didn't trust the sound of footsteps overhead. The threat of legal action metamorphosed into a social thing. The neighborhood called less. The congregation at church made small, averted comments. People who had known us for years looked at us like a headline. Then the quiet, heavy moment arrived. I received a call from my supervisor at the courthouse. He sounded tired and apologetic. He told me that a grand jury subpoena had been issued and that because my social security number was attached to federal filings, I needed to be available for interviews and the court would have to find coverage if I had to appear. He also gently suggested that the optics of the courthouse having an employee entangled in a federal investigation were difficult. I remember sitting down hard on the kitchen chair and feeling for the first time the real possibility of losing the one thing I had kept for myself. My job wasn't just my paycheck, it was my identity as a competent adult. The thought that I might be branded unreliable because my parents had used my name like a credit card felt like being punished for someone else's desperation. During that time, my leverage evaporated. I had been the one with procedural knowledge. I had been holding on to documents we could use to prove the fraud. But prosecutors don't move on sentiment. They move on evidence. And we had evidence that implicated my parents by name. I felt split down the middle, the person who hated their choice and the person who loved them despite it. I had to choose whether to shelter them and risk becoming implicated myself or to cooperate fully with authorities. My parents tried to cajole me into silence. "If you talk, they'll come after you too," my father said with a coldness I had never heard from him before. My mother cried and asked me to think of Leah. I chose to do what made the house I wanted to keep standing. I cooperated. The turning point was not dramatic. There was no confession over the phone, no grand letter in the mail, no lineup scene in a courthouse. The trigger was an email I found on my mother's laptop. It was a forwarded payment confirmation for the largest of the loans, and the attached file was a PDF of a fund transfer. The sender's address was the surgical center's billing office. The recipient was a shell corporation my parents had set up. The message chain included a single line I had not expected. "Please make sure the documentation shows the patient's relation is our daughter, Anna SNXXXXXXXX. The sender had typed that as if it were only paperwork, like filling in a box. That line, that instruction, I made the fraud deliberate on paper. I printed the email and took it to the federal investigator. It felt like handing someone a found weapon. He listened, asked me a few measured questions, then said, "You did the right thing bringing this." He told me they would request search warrants. He told me they would want to speak to my parents. He didn't promise anything about outcomes. He only said that when documentation existed with deliberate instructions to misrepresent identity, Federal statutes on aggravated identity theft come into play. I remember wishing he hadn't used the word aggravated. I also remember that in that instant, something in my balance shifted. The power dynamic that had let them lean on me morally was changing into an institutional force. Soon after, agents showed up to serve search warrants. They were polite, methodical, and quiet in the way people who have done this job for a long time are. They photographed the ledger, copied the laptop hard drives, took account numbers, seized the Shell Corporation paperwork, and in a move I hadn't expected, they took 2 years' worth of tax returns. My father sat on the couch and watched with a strange, blank face. My mother clutched her Bible and refused to speak to the agents. Leah, who had been home, watched with a small hand twisting the edge of a pillow. None of them protested loudly. None of them screamed apologies either. The house felt smaller, like a room that had had the walls moved in. Once federal investigators had a full file, prosecutors drafted charges. The indictment listed counts for identity theft, bank fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy. It spelled out in dry legal terms that a person who knowingly transfers, possesses, or uses another's identity in the commission of federal crimes could face significant prison time. Hearing the potential penalty allowed, up to 20 years per count, made the whole thing suddenly, painfully concrete. It was a legal number, a headline, but it landed in our house the way a patient diagnosis does, like a shape that will define every next day. Consequences arrived in waves. The first consequence was custody of the house. Lenders placed holds. The bank froze accounts tied to the Shell entities. My father's small retirement account, which he had used as collateral for some of the loans, was under threat. Our little house on Elm Street was put into a limbo where no one could access certain accounts without court approval. The practical thing I feared, that my grandmother's care would be disrupted, became real. For a week, we had to hire a homemaker out of pocket to manage medications. I paid with my own debit card to keep the pills organized and the appointments made. I felt the odd mix of being the family's savior and the family's betrayer. It was humiliating. Emotionally, the consequences were harder. My parents went from being warm, if flawed, to being people I saw in a new light. Desperate, dangerous in the way desperate people become when they cross legal lines, and ashamed. We stopped eating meals together. Conversations were now lists of what evidence we had destroyed or what letters we had ignored. My father stopped calling me Anna and started calling me the one with the paperwork. Humiliation turned into a slow erosion of intimacy. Professionally, the courthouse put a restriction on my assignments while the federal investigation was ongoing. I was not suspended, but the judge I worked for reassigned me away from sensitive files. It was a quiet professional exile. Co-workers were awkward in the hallways. I had to explain in bland legalese that I was a cooperating witness, that federal investigators had seen the documents and told me that cooperating was the correct move. People listened politely and then returned to work. The world kept functioning. That was another consequence. Nothing stopped because of us. The only thing that changed drastically was the axis of our family life. There were other payoffs, not satisfying perhaps, but real. The federal agents secured a freeze on the fraudulent accounts tied to my SSN. The credit reporting agencies adjusted my record pending the case. The courthouse allowed me to retain my job once it was clear I was not complicit. I had to prepare to testify, and the idea of sitting in a courtroom where my parents were on the other side of the table felt like a script from a play I would rather not direct. Still, their potential sentencing, the 20-year figure, meant that our immediate future was no longer about hidden bills. It was about legal process, discovery, plea, bargains, and a different kind of waiting. The emotional payoff was complicated. Leah was alive and stable. She was receiving outpatient care paid for, partly through legitimate family means and partly through a charitable fund some neighbours had set up when the story surfaced. That would have been worth everything if not for the cost. She visited once after the indictment and sat in the living room looking smaller than before. She didn't speak much. She kept reaching for my hand like a child might, searching for the warmth of someone who could still be trusted. I held her hand, but I could feel the tremor of another truth under our palms, that she had been the unspoken reason for all of it. The more tangible legal consequences progressed in predictable legal ways. Prosecutors offered discussions of plea deals. There were meetings with defense attorneys, some containing explanations and apologies for behaving ethically in prison arrest creation, some delivering arguments about diminished capacity and the pressure of seeing a child suffer. My parents spoke in lower voices about their motive, not as a legal defense, but as something like a justification. We did what any parents would do for their child. The law doesn't care for that argument the way the heart does. The processes of justice care for evidence, emails, ledgers, bank transfers, signed loan documents. We had provided both. When the indictments were filed publicly, our small neighbourhood learned the contours of the story in real time. A reporter from the local paper called and asked for comment. That evening, my sister posted a short, halting message on social media thanking people for their support. It did not mention the charges. It thanked the community for their generosity that had kept her care going. For a moment, the internet became a place where strangers could be kind and anonymous. That small good was a thread. The courtroom scenes were quieter than a television drama. They were procedural. Lawyers asked for discovery. Judges signed admission orders. Probation officers filed reports. There were no shout-outs or cinematic confessions. There were instead formal exchanges where facts were entered into a record. I testified twice. The first time I read facts to the court, dates, transfers, where money went. The second time I read a deposition where my parents had instructed staff at the surgical centre to put my name on files. Their faces were pale in the witness box. It is a peculiar domestic shame to watch your parents go through the mechanical motions of a trial and to feel both relief and sorrow for them. Relief because the truth was being acknowledged. Sorrow because the truth carried with it consequences that would reshape the last decades of their lives. Legally, they were charged with multiple counts, and the statutory maximum for the most serious aggregated count was 20 years. That number hung over us like a weather report. It was not a sentence, it was a maximum. Plea negotiations began. They were offered a chance to plead to lesser federal counts in exchange for restitution and cooperation. My parents asked me in the hallway outside the courtroom whether I would testify for the prosecution if they accepted the plea. The question felt like the universe demanding I choose a loyalty again. I said I would do what the law required. I said nothing more. The real payoff was not a dramatic sentencing. In our case, after months of negotiation and multiple court dates, my parents accepted a plea agreement to a reduced count with restitution obligations and a period of incarceration that could be measured in years rather than decades. The prosecutors, constrained by evidence and the family circumstances, recommended a sentence that acknowledged their age and lack of prior criminal history. There was no victory. There was simply the legal system doing what it does, weighing facts, recommending outcomes. The maximum penalty of 20 years became a headline that now sat beside a reality where my parents would likely serve a few years, pay restitution, and lose various assets. It felt like both too much and not enough. In the months after the plea, life recalibrated into a quieter life of logistics. We sold the house because the bank needed liquidity to settle certain claims. My grandmother moved in with my sister temporarily and then into a small assisted living facility I found across town. Leah enrolled in community programs that provided therapy at reduced rates. I kept working at the courthouse, slowly regaining the assignments I'd lost. The career damage was, mercifully, not permanent. The emotional damage was harder to measure. There were family dinners where my father's chair was empty, and my mother's laugh was a muted thing that came out forced at first. I visited them in the detention center once a week. The first time I saw them through the glass, my mother looked both thin and old. My father avoided my eyes. Humiliation gradually shifted into a pragmatic calendar of visits, calls, and paperwork. I learned to coordinate restitution payments and to sign forms that would permit family members to visit. The private client account we set up to manage Leah's care was audited annually. I took on the task of writing letters to the court describing my parents' character. The system, for all its coldness, allowed for nuance. The judge read my letter. The prosecutor knew I had cooperated fully. The sentence reflected both the wrongdoing and the context. There were losses I did not expect. The neighbours who had once trusted my family stopped inviting us for block parties. Old friends sent polite messages that were glossy and thin. My name, once associated with quiet competence at the courthouse, had been linked for a time to a federal indictment. I had to reaffirm my identity in other ways. I did so by doing my job well and by making a small, steady home for my grandmother and Leah. Those acts were not redemptive, but they were steady. The thing that stayed with me was the memory of my father's hand when he first asked me not to talk to the authorities. It wasn't the betrayal so much as the moment I realized they were willing to make me part of the mechanism that would hide the truth. Families with secrets ask for silence to preserve themselves. Families that break the law to protect a member ask for silence in a way that asks you to erase yourself. I refused that erasure. The decision cost me intimacy, but it preserved my legal and moral standing. Now, years later, the immediate legal storm has passed into the background of our lives. My parents served their terms in a low-security facility, paid restitution, and are trying to rebuild in the way people do. One appointment, one meal, one apology at a time. Leah continues to receive care and works intermittently with a support network. I visit them sometimes and keep the visits short. We are both careful around the subject of debts. We avoid the ledger, and sometimes we speak about the weather. There is caution in our closeness now, a respect for the fragility of trust. I want to be clear about final consequences because it's what people always ask. The up to 20 years, Headline in our case was the maximum. It did not reflect the sentence they received. The federal system offered them plea options and considered their age, health, and cooperation. The legal reality was more practical than the media phrasing suggests. They did spend time incarcerated. They lost significant assets. They will be under supervision for years. Those outcomes were heavy enough. I don't want to end this as a sermon. There is no tidy moral to pack into a last paragraph. We acted, we suffered, and we lived with the results. I say that because I promised you a story, and stories have to be honest about mess. What I can offer is an account that the names we carry are not frivolous, that the lines between love and wrongdoing can blur, and that legal consequences follow decisions, however loving their intent may have been. If you stayed with me through this, thank you. If this resonated with you, or you want to hear more about what happened in court, or how Leah's care is handled now, let me know in the comments. If you found this helpful, please leave a like. If you want to hear more stories like this, consider subscribing. Did something like this ever happen in your family? I'd be grateful if you'd share in the comments.